Imagine standing on a rain-slicked hilltop above the Tiber River on a grey April morning, 753 BC. The river below churns brown and fast, swollen from recent floods. Around you 300 men, rough, wind-burned, carrying iron-tipped spears and sheepskin cloaks, stand, watching a single figure at the crest of the hill. He grips the handles of a wooden plough. A white ox strains in the traces ahead of him, and the man begins to walk. Slowly, deliberately, carving a shallow furrow through the hilltop mud in a great sacred circle. He has the jaw of someone who intends to win every argument he ever starts. His name, according to every story his descendants will tell, is Romulus. And in this moment, with the gulls screaming above the Tiber below, with those 300 exiles and shepherds watching in silence, he is drawing the boundary of a city that will one day field armies in Spain, Egypt, Britain and Persia simultaneously. A city whose roads, laws, calendar and architecture still form the hidden skeleton of the world you and I live in right now. It begins here, in the mud, with a plough and a fratricide. Welcome to Mystique History. Did you know that the city which would one day rule from Scotland to Mesopotamia began as a handful of Iron Age huts on a marshy hillside, and that its founding myth is soaked in betrayal, divine intervention, and one of the ancient world's most disturbing acts of brotherly violence? Let me explain. The story of Rome's birth has two layers, and both of them are extraordinary. The first is the myth, the second is the archaeology. And the most remarkable thing about these two layers is how often they agree with each other, not in gods and divine wolves, but in timing, in location, in the physical evidence still lying beneath the streets of modern Rome, waiting for excavators to find it. Let's start long before Romulus. The Italian peninsula in the centuries preceding 753 BC was no empty stage. Core samples taken from the ancient soil beneath Rome show occupation stretching back to at least 1600 BC in certain areas, with some evidence from the Palatine Hill pushing even further, towards 1700 BC. These were not city dwellers. They were clans of herders and farmers moving across volcanic lowlands between the Alban Hills and the sea, following rhythms of grazing and flood and harvest. The Tiber was their highway, their boundary, and their danger.
We see the marker stone.
And its eastern bank, where 7 distinct hills rose above the floodplain, offered something precious in the ancient world: elevation, defense, and a clear view of whatever was coming before it arrived. The Palatine Hill was the first of those 7 to show serious, permanent habitation. Archaeologists digging on its southwestern slopes have found evidence of settlement going back to the 10th century BC, a full 2 centuries before the traditional founding date of 753 BC. People were already living on the Palatine long before Romulus supposedly drew his line in the earth. They lived in oval huts, single-room structures built from timber poles set into holes carved directly into the tufa bedrock, walls of woven branches plastered with clay, roofs thatched with river reeds. Each hut housed an extended family. Several huts formed a clan compound.
Because we have found not just post holes.
The whole hilltop held perhaps a few hundred people. We know what those houses looked like because we have found not just post holes and hearth ash and pottery, but also miniature clay models of those huts used as cremation urns buried in the low valley below the hill, the flat, marshy space that would one day become the Roman Forum. Something shifts in that valley's archaeology around the early 8th century BC. The graves go silent, and the space that had been a cemetery begins to show different activity: market stalls, ritual deposits, the residue of communal fires,
Finest hides, fresh from the hunt.
a graveyard becoming a public square. That transformation signals a community in the process of conceptual change, people who have begun to think of themselves as something more than a collection of families,
Now be shared by all our clans.
something shared, something approaching for the very first time, the idea of a city. And it is precisely in this window, the 8th century BC, that the legend places the founding of Rome. Now, the myth. Because you cannot understand the real Rome without first letting the legend speak. The story does not begin on the Palatine Hill. It begins in a throne room in the Latin city of Alba Longa, set in the volcanic Alban Hills roughly 20 kilometers to the southeast. Alba Longa traced its own founding to Ascanius, son of the Trojan hero Aeneas, and had been ruled by his descendants for generations. The succession now rested on two brothers, Numitor, the elder, and Romulus, the younger.
Brother, the choice is simple. Rule these lands.
When the brothers divided their inheritance, Romulus offered a choice. On one side, the kingdom itself, the throne, the territory, the armies. On the other, the treasury of Alba Longa, rumored to include the legendary gold that Aeneas had carried from burning Troy. Numitor, valuing kingship over wealth, chose the crown.
With this gold, Latium's finest.
Romulus took the treasury, and with it purchased every mercenary in Latium. Then he used them to take the throne as well. Numitor was deposed. His male heirs were eliminated.
A son of Numitor's line will destroy him.
Cassius Dio records that an oracle had warned Romulus he would be destroyed by a son of Numitor's line, which explains the thoroughness of the purge. He thought he had sealed every gap. He had not. Numitor had a daughter. Her name was Rhea Silvia.
People love her. You cannot touch the girl.
I am the king.
Romulus could not kill her without turning the people of Alba Longa against him.
You swear before Vesta to remain chaste and faithful.
So he found a more elegant solution. He made her a Vestal virgin, a priestess of the goddess Vesta, bound by sacred vows of permanent celibacy. No husband, no children, no future heirs. It was a cold political calculation dressed in religious devotion. And it almost worked. Almost, because Rhea Silvia became pregnant. The ancient sources diverge here in ways that reveal how uncomfortable even the Romans were with what their founding required. The celebrated version says the war god Mars visited Rhea Silvia in a sacred grove and fathered the twins. The poet Ovid renders the encounter almost tenderly. The historian Livy is bleaker. He suggests Rhea Silvia was simply violated by an unknown man and that the divine paternity claim was the only story a disgraced Vestal could tell without being condemned to burial alive, the traditional punishment for a Vestal who broke her vows. Regardless of the version, 2 boys were born, and Romulus wanted them gone. He could not execute them openly. So he ordered a servant to take the infants to the Tiber and let the river decide. The Tiber was high and swollen. The servant couldn't reach the main current. He placed the basket at the water's edge, at the foot of the Palatine Hill, beneath a sacred fig tree the Romans would later call the Ficus Ruminalis, and walked away. The basket didn't sink, and the wolf found it. The she-wolf, the Lupa, sacred animal of Mars, is not merely a symbol. She is a theological statement encoded in the myth's DNA. By having a wolf nurse the twins, the story is telling every Roman something they understood immediately. These boys carry the nature of war in them. They are predators by inheritance. They will not be tamed. When the shepherd Faustulus, chief herdsman to Romulus himself according to some sources, found the infants nursing in the wolf's cave on the Palatine slopes, alive and loud, he took them home without saying a word to his master. He and his wife raised them as their own sons. The boys grew up as herdsmen, learning the hills and the river, learning animals and combat, growing into exactly the kind of physical specimens that tribes recognize on sight and follow without being asked. It was a cattle raid that unraveled everything. A dispute between the shepherds of Numitor and the shepherds of Romulus turned violent. Remus was captured and brought before Romulus, then sent for judgment before Numitor. And Numitor looked at this extraordinary young prisoner, the height, the bearing, the eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. He began to ask questions, and Remus, who had never been taught to be afraid of old men, answered honestly.
But where did you find this amulet? Tell me.
At the same moment, across the hills, Faustulus told Romulus the truth of his origin.
The man you called father was merely...
Both revelations landed simultaneously, as though the story itself had been holding its breath for exactly this moment. What followed was not a negotiation.
Form ranks! By the Tiber, you are no longer shepherds.
Romulus organized his band of shepherds and fighters into strike companies, 100 men each company captain carrying a bundle of hay on a pole as a rallying standard. Plutarch tells us this is the direct origin of the manipulus, the maniple, the tactical unit that would become the foundational building block of the Roman legions that eventually conquered the Mediterranean world. The word manipulus means handful, bundle. Rome's most celebrated military organization was invented by a shepherd planning a jailbreak. Romulus attacked from outside Alba Longa's walls, while Remus incited revolt inside. Romulus never saw it coming. He was taken and ended before he could form a single coherent plan.
Hail the rightful king!
Numitor was restored to his throne. The people of Alba Longa did not mourn the usurper. The brothers refused the crown of Alba Longa that Numitor offered them. They returned instead to the hills above the Tiber, to the slopes where they had been found as infants, and gathered their followers. That following was deliberately, pointedly, not aristocratic. It was assembled from shepherds, runaway slaves, exiles, outcasts, and anyone else who wanted a second chance in a place where the past didn't follow you. This was Rome's original population, not a nobility. An assembly of the dispossessed, held together by two exceptional men and the shared hunger for something new. Then the argument started. Romulus wanted the Palatine, elevated, defensible, the hill of their childhood, commanding the river crossing below. Remus wanted the Aventine, the next hill south. Both positions were reasonable, both were absolutely non-negotiable. They agreed to submit the question to augury, the sacred reading of bird omens. Each brother took up position on his chosen hill and watched the sky. Remus, on the Aventine, saw his sign first. 6 vultures, banking on the thermal above the hillside. 6 was not nothing. He sent word to Romulus. But before the messenger arrived, Romulus had received 12 vultures above the Palatine in a great wheeling column that his followers greeted with shouts and raised spears. The dispute erupted immediately. Remus's men argued priority, Romulus's men argued number. Both positions were defensible. Both sides believed completely in their own claim. What might have been a theological disagreement became, under the weight of everything at stake, something irreversible. Romulus took his plough and his white ox and drove the sacred furrow around the Palatine's crest, the Pomerium, the consecrated boundary within which Rome would exist and beyond which it would one day reach across the world. The plough was lifted at each future gate. Everything else was inviolable earth. And Remus watched, and Remus crossed the line. Livy says he leapt over the half-built wall mockingly, asking aloud whether such a ditch was supposed to stop an enemy. Plutarch provides a version where one of Romulus's followers, a man named Scylla, whose name became a Latin word for speed because he acted so fast, struck Remus down without waiting for Romulus's order. Ovid records that the ghost of Remus later appeared to Faustulus, explicitly absolving his brother of personal guilt, insisting that Scylla acted alone and that Romulus grieved even as he accepted the outcome. Different versions, the same ending. Remus fell. The boundary was sealed, and Romulus, standing alone now, sole founder of something unprecedented, spoke words the Romans quoted for 8 centuries afterward. "So perish whoever else shall leap over my walls." The city was named Roma, after Romulus, and Rome was alive, but a city of warriors without women is not a city. It is a warband with an expiration date. Romulus sent envoys to neighboring Latin and Sabine tribes requesting intermarriage. Every tribe refused. The settlement on the Palatine was viewed with undisguised suspicion, a population of rootless men, many of them former slaves and fugitives, with no ancestral land and no obvious reason to trust. Some refusals came with contempt. "You have a home for your runaway slaves," one tradition records a neighbor saying, "but not for our daughters." Romulus's response was the Consualia, a harvest festival thrown open to all neighboring peoples. Families came from Sabine towns, from Latin villages scattered through the hills, fathers, mothers, brothers, and the young women whose futures were about to be decided without their knowledge. At a prearranged signal, Romulus's men moved. They seized the young Sabine women. The men fled. The women were kept. Roman tradition placed their number somewhere between 30 and several hundred, depending on the source. The Romans would celebrate this event, the Raptio Sabinarum, not as a crime, but as the founding act of Roman society. This tells you something deeply important about Rome's self-image. It never pretended to have been born innocent. It built the violence into the foundation story deliberately, as a statement about what it was, a civilization that took what it needed, and then, crucially, tried to make something lasting out of the wreckage. The Sabine king Titus Tatius assembled his army and marched. A Roman woman named Tarpeia, whose motivations the sources debate endlessly, opened a gate in the Capitoline citadel to the Sabine forces. Fighting broke out across the hills, and then the Sabine women ran onto the battlefield. Carrying infants in their arms, Rome's children, Sabine children, a new mixed generation, they placed themselves between their fathers' swords and their husbands' spears. According to Livy, they cried out that they were now the living link between these two peoples, that they had made their peace, that they would not watch their children become orphans of either side. The fighting stopped. Titus Tatius came down from the hill. He and Romulus agreed to rule jointly. The Sabines settled on the Capitoline and Quirínal hills, and the 7 separate tribal communities, each previously its own tight, suspicious hilltop world, began the long, violent, improbable process of becoming one people. That process required a center, and a center required draining the marsh. The Romans accomplished this through the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, a drainage canal cutting roughly a mile through the soft volcanic tufa beneath Rome, collecting runoff from the Esquiline, Viminal and Quirínal hills and emptying it into the Tiber. Built in its earliest form under the Etruscan kings of the 6th century BC, its mouth is still visible today on the Tiber's bank near the old Forum Boarium. It still functions. After 27 centuries, it still carries Rome's groundwater to the river. That is the kind of infrastructure that only gets built when someone with genuine ambition, genuine resources, and genuine organizational command arrives on the scene. That someone was the Etruscan king Tarquin the Elder. Around 616 BC, a man from the Etruscan city of Tarquinia, a sophisticated urban civilization to Rome's north, fluent in monumental architecture, hydraulic engineering, bronzeworking, and political theatre, became Rome's 5th king. His Etruscan name was Lucumo. His wife Tanaquil was a noblewoman skilled in augury, who reportedly interpreted an eagle snatching her husband's hat as he crossed the Tiber and replacing it as a sign of future royalty. She was right. As Tarquin the Elder, he expanded the Senate, organized the Roman Games, chose the location for the Circus Maximus between the Palatine and Aventine Hills, ordered the foundations of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline, and began the Cloaca Maxima. Under his hand and those of his successors, the Forum transformed from a muddy market into a paved civic center with temples, a stone road, the earliest version of the Via Sacra, the Sacred Way, and buildings that declared, for the first time, that this was not a village. This was a city. The last Etruscan king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, was the kind of ruler who builds magnificent things while destroying everything else. He completed the Cloaca Maxima and the great Temple of Jupiter, but he drove his construction projects using Roman citizens as forced laborers, treating free men like property. The resentment built for years beneath the surface of Rome like groundwater beneath tufa. The breaking point came in 509 BC, not from a battle, but from a single act of violence committed by Tarquin's son Sextus against a Roman noblewoman named Lucretia.
The time of
She
kings
informed
is
her
over.
father and husband of
Rome
what had
will
been
be a
done to her,
republic,
then
or
took
I will
her own
see it
life.
fall.
Her kinsman, Lucius Junius Brutus, who had survived the Tarquin court for years by performing harmlessness, his very name meaning the dull one, revealed himself in that moment as something entirely other. He held Lucretia's knife before the assembled nobility of Rome. He gave the speech that ended 2.5 centuries of monarchy. Tarquin the Proud was expelled. The kings were gone. And Rome, at last, was a republic. 2 elected consuls replaced the single king. Laws were written down. Citizens gained rights. A senate governed in place of a throne. The city that had begun as 300 men on a muddy hill, following a ploughman through the April rain, became the institution that would absorb Greece, crush Carthage, swallow Egypt whole, and eventually stretch across a territory larger than the continental United States. All of it carrying, in its blood and its language and its law and its architecture, the mark of those first desperate, brilliant, violent years on the 7 hills above the Tiber. The Palatine Hill still stands in Rome today. You can walk on it. You can look down from it onto the Forum below. The same Forum that was a graveyard in 1000 BC, a marsh in 800 BC, a market in 700 BC, and the center of the known world in 100 BC. In 2007, archaeologists inserting probes beneath the Palatine's southwestern slope found a large vaulted cavity 15 meters underground, decorated with white pumice and colored mosaics. A space some scholars believe may be the Lupercal itself, the cave the Romans venerated for 1,000 years as the site where the she-wolf nursed 2 abandoned infants back from the edge of nothing. The excavation was halted before it could be completed. The questions remain open. Rome still holds more secrets than it has given up. That is the truth about this city. It never stops beginning. The wolf is still in the cave. The plough furrow is still in the earth. And the line that Romulus drew on that April morning is still there, beneath centuries of marble and stone and empire, exactly where he left it. If this story lit something in you, and it should, because this is the origin of the civilization we all inherited, and that origin is stranger and darker and more human than any clean mythology could ever capture, then subscribe to Mystique History right now. Because every video we make will take you this deep, this far back, and this close to the moment when the world we recognize first decided to exist. I'm your host at Mystique History, and I want to know, what historical event should I recreate next? Let me know in the comments.